Good evening, classmates. This week we were supposed to talk about Jefferson's legacy. Thomas Jefferson is a very interesting historical figure in my mind. Recently I got to go to Monticello and found that experience to be awesome, for lack of a better word. But Jefferson's legacy has been greatly researched, and it's been a topic of popular historiography since before he was even dead. I think that the real probing into his history and into who he was probably began during his presidency and then directly after his presidency. And in particular, we see a lot of rhetoric and a lot of talk about his seemingly contradictory lifestyle with what he was saying about slavery. And it caused a lot of recoil for him during his presidency and thereafter with people in England and Federalists who were against some of his personal policies. He was noted as saying that slavery was an institution of moral depravity and that it was a hideous blot on an otherwise excellent society. But he himself owned slaves. So it seems awkward that he would have that strong of a feeling and use such strong language and yet practice this institution in which he calls a moral depravity. However, personally, I have some thoughts on that. I think that through our readings and through other research with Thomas Jefferson, we kind of see the idea that Thomas Jefferson, who was obviously a brilliant man and very smart, also knew that slavery was very entrenched in the colonies, in the newly formed Republic of America. And he also knew that taking out such a interwoven institution into the nation was not going to be an easy fight. I also think that he saw it as one that, at the time of the nation, was not something that the nation could survive at that time. So his views on slavery might not have been completely hypocritical. However, I think he knew it was a fight that could not be taken on and that the country could not go into at that moment. Continuing on with this idea of slavery in Jefferson, and especially in the Jefferson legacy, when we think about legacy, of course, we think about handing down things down through the ages. And of course, there's a particularly interesting part about his history involving a lovely slave named Sally Hemings. Now, Sally Hemings, and for those of you that don't know, I'm a Broadway nut. I love Broadway stuff, and I love, especially right now, I'm kind of loving the musical Hamilton because it fuses Broadway and it fuses history, which is just fantastic. But in the musical Hamilton, there's a moment in the show where Jefferson appears. And he's finally arrived, It's the late 1780s, and he's been in France as the ambassador, and he's just returned home. And there's a throwaway line, seemingly, in this musical. And he says, "Sally, be a lamb, darling, won't you open it?" Talking about a letter from the president. And it's the only time that Sally's mentioned. But yet I think it's interesting that Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote it, thought it was at least a chunk enough of something interesting to throw in there. But the implication, of course, with the word darling would be that he's playing into this story of Jefferson's love interest with Sally Hemings. And while this is an excellent and delicious tale, something worthy of Big Brother or The Bachelor or Bachelorette or whatever, it's founded mostly upon oral histories of those children of Sally Hemings who made it to the late 1800s and later told others about the same story. However, or in Jane Lewis and Peter Onuf's description of Jefferson's histories, they say that this perpetuation of particular oral histories of Jefferson's lineage are a major issue in historiography that has shaped his history more than his actual history has. However, if we look at other avenues, and we look at the other evidence, there's no clear-cut evidence that actually says that her children are Jeffersons, Thomas Jeffersons, that is. Of course, the most useful evidence to say that they are comes from the DNA study from 1998. This evidence does solidify the fact that there was, in fact, the Jefferson Y chromosome found within the descendants of Sally Hemings. However, this could very well have been his older brother Randolph. He was known to be a little bit of a tomcat, and it's still a discrepancy that we need to heed as historiographers or as historians. Also, in all of his letters and writings, and I find this particularly very strong, There's never a slip up with Jefferson. He never accidentally mentions her in a light that would be uncharacteristic of mentioning someone who is a house slave. Um, I mean, I take it as the letters of that day were the texts of this day. Seemingly, if I were in a relationship, especially one that was maybe inappropriate, I would have a feeling that would slip up at some point in that history. And of course, it never does. And Sally left no actual written history of her own, no footprint to denote the lineage of her children back to Jefferson. But so, due to lack of this direct mentioning of Sally outside of common conduct, one could definitely surmise that it's possible that another Jefferson descendant was responsible for the DNA evidence of the lineage of Sally Hemings. And I think that's super interesting. And of course, his legacy will live on for years, and I'm sure we'll find out more and more about him. And he's definitely an interesting character to look into. Thank you.